As new ownership is set to take over the Orioles this week, we first must look back and remember the owner that came before, Peter Angelos, who died at the age of 94 on Saturday. We look back at the complicated legacy of the Orioles owner who brought some success, a lot of failure, and did a lot in the city of Baltimore, both good and bad for some, but we'll break it all down. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, March 26th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look back at the life and really the time in charge of the Orioles of Peter Angelos, who passed away at the age of 94 on Saturday, the owner of the O's since 1993. And his family will be selling the team to the group led by David Rubenstein, and reporting from Evan Drellich in The Athletic on Monday telling us that the vote is coming on Wednesday from the MLB owners, the final vote needed to approve Rubenstein as the control person. And it could be that on opening day on Thursday, Rubenstein takes over officially for the Angelos family. And with Peter's passing as well, wanted to look back on his life, his time with the Orioles, both the good and the bad, and recap again a complicated legacy for the Orioles owner. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonmlb and use code all lowercase LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. So that was the news from the weekend. And we had known really since 2017 that Peter Angelos was not in good health, was in failing health, and that had been the case for a while. And when MLB appointed John Angelos, Peter's son, as control person of the Orioles back in 2020, it was basically because Peter Angelos was no longer in good enough health to be the control person and run the Orioles. And he held on, but he passed away, as the Orioles announced on Saturday, at age 94. Now, going along with that has been the Orioles sale. David Rubenstein and his group agreeing back in January to purchase the Orioles. First, it was going to be just about 40% of the team out of the 70% of the team in total that the Angelos family owns. They agreed to purchase it at an evaluation of $1.725 billion for the team. And now Evan Drellich of The Athletic reported first on Monday that this Wednesday will be the final owner's vote that the Orioles need. They need 22 of the 29 other owners to vote yes on David Rubenstein, which they are going to do. And on Wednesday, it's going to be signed, sealed, and delivered, Rubenstein taking over as control person for the Orioles. Now, the things we had learned about when the agreement was made between Angelos and Rubenstein, that once Peter Angelos did pass away, that is when John Angelos would sell the remaining stake that the Angeloses had in the Orioles. Now, it was in Drellich's story in The Athletic on Monday that the rest of the share, so the Angeloses own in full about 70% of the Orioles. So that final 30% that Angelos was going to hold on to until his father passed away, that is not going to be an immediate exchange here. So it'll take a little bit longer for Rubenstein to get the extra 30%. But either way, he will have the most stake in the team at 40%, and he will be named the official control person by MLB this week, which means by opening day, he will be de facto the Orioles owner and the control person of this team. So for that reason, with the change happening and with Peter Angelos' passing on Saturday, just wanted to look back here on Peter Angelos' life and his time as Orioles owner. And, I have been, first of all, very combative against John Angelos, and for good reason. Since John took over in 2020, the Orioles have seen a lot of losing early in that time. Now, he did bring in Mike Elias, and he has certainly turned this Orioles franchise around, but Angelos just made it a point to put his foot in his mouth at every turn and to just make a fool of himself, and at times make a fool of the Orioles when he did anything in the public view. And for that reason, that's why I was so celebratory when it was announced that Rubenstein would be buying the team, not necessarily because it was specifically David Rubenstein, but just because John Angelos would be out. Now, I was an Orioles fan while Peter Angelos was the control person. I think the first Orioles team I really remember watching was probably the 2005 Orioles, and that was right in the middle of Peter Angelos trying and failing every year to put together a good baseball team in the 2000s. But I've been much more connected to the John Angelos era. Now, I completely had an incredible connection with the Buck Showalter years, but in terms of knowing what's going on with ownership, hosting this podcast has helped as well, which I started in 2020. It's been John Angelos. So I haven't gotten as much of the nitty gritty every day of Peter Angelos being really in your face as the owner of the Orioles. But I do think as I embarked on this kind of look back for Peter Angelos, that there was a lot of negatives in the ownership tenure of Peter Angelos. And there were a lot of losses. There were a lot of losses for John Angelos, but the last couple of years turned into a good amount of wins. To me, Peter Angelos is almost painted in a better light at this point because of just the things John did publicly. And Peter did some things publicly too that didn't shine the best on him. But just the amount of a doofus and a true fail son that John Angelos was and is, I think, time heals wounds, but also apparently your idiot son can heal wounds as well. And that's what seemed to happen here a little bit. And so now with Peter's passing, we do know once this second part of the sale starts to get into play and happens over the next couple of weeks or months or whatever it takes, at some point early in the 2024 season, the Angeloses will be done with the Orioles. Rubenstein will have purchased all of their right around 70% that they own, and the Angeloses will be done for good. And so because of that, and with the passing, let's just look back at the entire tenure, the good, the bad, all of it, the complicated legacy, as I've called it, for Peter Angelos as the Orioles owner. And we'll start with the good coming up right after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. Now, the football season is certainly over, but the action on the floor is heating up. Whether it's tournament season or the fight for playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of year. Get in on the excitement with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where you can turn your hoops knowledge into serious cash. You can turn $10 into $1,000. NBA, NHL, and college basketball today on Prize Picks. What do? You just play and pick more or less on any stat line. So if you're looking at, let's say, an NBA game coming up and you're looking at the Wizards, you might get Kyle Kuzma, more or less 20.5 points. You're just picking more or less. That's it. And the more you get right, the more money you can win. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100 at Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So on today's Tuesday episode, I wanted to jump into the complicated legacy of Peter Angelos as Orioles owner after he passed away at the age of 94 on Saturday. And I wanted to start with the good. And I think the number one on the good list that people talk about is that he kept the Orioles in Baltimore. And now it is totally fair to say that when Peter Angelos purchased the Orioles for then a record sale of $173 million in 1993, more than any sports franchise had been purchased for, the O's were not moving at that point. They had just moved into a new ballpark. Oriole Park at Camden Yards opened the year before in 1992. They were selling out every single game because of the new ballpark. That was not a team that was going to be moved. But because Baltimoreans were less than 10 years removed from the Baltimore Colts in the middle of the night, just picking up and moving to Indianapolis, there was still a lot of pain there. And when the Orioles were being sold in 1993 at bankruptcy court in New York, there was a person named Jeffrey Loria who went on to buy the Marlins, who was a New York art dealer and collector and made a lot of money, who was making a serious bid for the Orioles. He lived in New York and people were worried he's going to move the team somewhere else like a piece of art. he's not going to keep it in Baltimore, was still hurt by the Colts. And Peter Angelos, who grew up in Highlandtown, lived in Maryland his whole life, worked at his dad's bar, ran for local office, became a lawyer in Baltimore, in Maryland, was truly Baltimore and Maryland through and through. And when he bought the team with a couple of other investors to help him out, the number one thing was this team is staying in Baltimore. And that was huge for the city. Again, they had just opened a new ballpark. They were selling out every game. This team was not moving no matter who bought the team in reality. But in the fans' minds, after what had happened with the Colts, they needed someone local to buy this team. And that is what happened here with Peter Angelos in 1993. He also cared about the area, the city, and the state of Maryland. Donated millions of dollars around the city and the state. And as I mentioned, was born here, lived here his entire life. And I think he truly wanted to see the Orioles win. Like, he was a fan of the team, wanted to see them win, wanted to see the city prosper around the Orioles. He was also willing to spend on this team. And this is something that I think, because of the later years of Peter Angelos being in charge and not spending as much and penny pinching a little bit more, gets lost in the fold that, especially when he first took over, Peter Angelos was spending, and he was spending with the best of them. The Orioles had top 5 payrolls throughout the late 90s. And even the payroll to begin the 1998 season, after the Orioles had gone to back-to-back ALCSs in 1996 and 97 and had a roster full of all-stars, the Orioles had the top payroll in baseball on opening day of 1998, even above the Yankees. Peter Angelos was willing to spend to just create success for this team. He handed out plenty of free agent contracts. Some were good. Some helped those 96 and 97 Orioles teams. Some were bad. Some hindered the teams in the mid-2000s. Some looked like the one that was Chris Davis, which will go down as one of the worst contracts in Orioles history. But he also, even though some of those contracts weren't great in the mid-2000s, and there was a lot of losing that we'll get to from 1998 through 2011, he still spent that money. And especially in the early 2000s, gave Orioles fans players to root for when, Miguel Tejada and Javi Lopez and Rafael Palmeiro and these guys were on these teams. It didn't lead to a lot of success in the 2000s, unfortunately, but he went and added Sammy Sosa to the Orioles. I mean, you can say what you will about how that season went, but he was invested in spending money to bring in players that people wanted to watch. And unfortunately for him, it did not equate to a whole lot of wins during his tenure, but he was also, to a point, willing to give out extensions. Now, again, that penny pinching happened more and more later, and he wasn't able to extend players like Manny Machado and Kevin Gausman and Dylan Bundy, and some of that was because the team was going in the wrong direction, but others with Machado, they just were not willing to give him what he was worth extension-wise, but they still did extend players, and guys like Adam Jones and JJ Hardy, who were huge to those Buck years for this Orioles franchise, they got extensions from the Orioles to stay in Baltimore. Also, in terms of how he became a millionaire and eventually a billionaire, there's really no way to fully ethically become a millionaire or a billionaire in our society, but he made his millions in truly not the worst way. He was a lawyer in Baltimore who represented really kind of the common man. He represented workers and unions, and his biggest case and what made Peter Angelos famous was representing workers in asbestos cases and getting a lot of money for a lot of people who were affected by asbestos in their line of work. And he got those people settlements. He also made a whole lot of money off of those settlements as well. And there's an argument to be made that, well, he made his fortune off the backs of the less fortunate, and he was kind of exploiting them for the issues that they had going on. And he made a lot of money off of that, and he should have, more of that money should have gone to the people who were affected. You can make that argument. You can also talk about how, hey, somebody had to stick up for them. Somebody had to do the job. And he changed the lives of a lot of people in this area for at least, their lives had been altered by the asbestos and what they'd gone through, but at least helping them out with settlements, with money, with just a little more peace of mind. And a lot of people are grateful to him for that. But there is also the flip side of it as well. But again, compared to how a lot of MLB owners have made their money, representing union workers and people affected by asbestos and getting them the payouts they deserved, that's pretty high up on the list of the most ethical ways, at least among the MLB owners, to make your money. And also, the biggest thing for me, and I understand for some people, this is not a positive. Now, I don't get that line of thinking, but that's okay. He might be the only pro-labor owner in MLB history. And this was a huge point of contention between him and then MLB Commissioner Bud Selig. He was not going to give in to the rest of the owners, and he made it known. And the other owners did not like Peter Angelos, especially back in the 90s. And some of the grudge that is held against Angelos, some of it has even contributed, I think, to the Orioles not having hosted the All-Star game since they opened the ballpark and then hosted it in 1993. And they haven't been back there since. They've been back to other ballparks multiple times. Camden Yards is still beautiful. Baltimore is still a great city, and they haven't been back there. The other owners did not like Peter Angelos because he had spent his career and made his money representing generally union workers. And so when the Major League Baseball players went on strike in the 1994 season, very soon into Angelos' tenure as Orioles owner, he sided with the players. He was disappointed with how Bud Selig and people from the commissioner's office had handled these union negotiations. He felt he had been a part of so many of these negotiations, had been in that world, and he felt that he could have done a much better job and that baseball was kind of biffing it. And he also refused to use any replacement players in the 1994 or 1995 season. He, was in support of, hey, if they're going to go on strike, I am not going to use scabs as players. And a lot of the other owners, pretty much all the other owners, were on board with using replacement players and continuing the 94 season, or at least starting up the 95 season. And Angelos said no, and he was the only owner on that side. And that is a pro-labor stance you don't see from a lot of millionaires. But again, that is the reputation he had made and how he'd made his money. And you can argue about how genuine that stance was, but it's a stance that really no other owner has taken, and I think would take. And while the owners hated him for that, the players, and I think a lot of the community, really respected him for that stance that he took back in 94 and 95. And I don't think we'll see another owner ever take a pro-labor stance, especially when there is bargaining happening or a strike going on or any kind of lockout happening between the owners and the players. And for that, I commend Angelos in his time as Orioles owner. He did things differently. I mean, you have to say that. I mean, you can argue what side of the aisle here in terms of the good or the bad of Peter Angelos the exhibition game in Cuba falls into, when the Orioles back in 1999 agreed to go play a game against the Cuban All-Stars / the Cuban national team down in Havana in 1999. Then about a couple of weeks later, the Cuban team came up and played an exhibition game in Baltimore in May of that year. And that is something Angelos pushed for. He felt that the long-held embargo on Cuba was unfair to a lot of people involved in the situation. And he tried and failed multiple times throughout the early to mid-90s to get that game to happen. It could never happen. And finally, with Bill Clinton as president, Clinton had kind of put together a little bit of a softening on the embargo with Cuba. It allowed a few more people to go down there, allowed a few more things to happen between the U.S. and Cuba. And Angelos took that as his advantage, and he was meeting with the State Department. And it was basically, and it's written about in the stories, that it was basically just Peter Angelos and President Bill Clinton came together to push for this game to happen in Cuba. And it did. And the Orioles won the game in extra innings. And again, you're going to hear a lot of different opinions about how people feel about that game being played. And I'm not going to get into that. There are certainly arguments on both sides for why that game actually happened and what it actually did for baseball and the relations between the two countries. But a game hadn't been played by a major league team in Cuba since 1959. It had been 40 years, and Angelos was able to get that done. He went down to Cuba with Bud Selig and was sitting in the stands with Fidel Castro during that game between the Orioles and the Cuban national team. It's quite honestly just almost an unbelievable thing that happened when it did. And Peter Angelos was the one who pushed to get that done. And you can't say that he did it like the other owners. He was different. And in some ways, you got to at least commend him for that. But of course, when you oversee as many losing seasons as Peter Angelos did, there is also the bad that comes with this, and reasons why a lot of Orioles fans have a very negative reaction when you bring up the name Peter Angelos. And we want to go through those things as well, and we'll do that when we return here for the final segment of today's episode. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. You can say goodbye to your busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. And I'm still riding with the Tennessee Volunteers on the men's side. And we're going to switch it over to South Carolina on the women's side. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. So with Orioles owner Peter Angelos passing away at age 94 on Saturday, I wanted to try to give you the whole picture of his time as Orioles owner. We started with the good and the eccentric of Peter Angelos, and there is certainly the bad as well. And I think the number one bad thing is he oversaw a whole lot of losing seasons. Now, the Orioles had success when he first took over, and they were successful into the strike-shortened season, and obviously 96 and 97 were amazing years for the O's. They should have won the World Series one of those 2 years. Unfortunately, it just did not happen. Sometimes you just get unlucky with a lot of close losses to Cleveland. Sometimes, even though there's an umpire stationed in the outfield, they can't see the things that are happening by the right field wall. Either way, the Orioles unfortunately didn't come up with a World Series win in either of those years. And then, well, things went downhill. And from 1998 through 2011, Peter Angelos, as the owner, oversaw undoubtedly the worst stretch in Orioles franchise history. 14 consecutive losing seasons. And really, there were barely any of those years where they were anything close to being a competitive team consistently on the field throughout the year. It was a dark, dark time. That was the age I grew up in of Orioles baseball. I mean, there was a lot of, I loved B.J. Surhoff, but there was some Jeff Conine and Jay Gibbons and Corey Patterson and Geronimo Gil. And, Rodrigo Lopez was pretty good, but I was watching a lot of Bruce Chen and Kevin Millwood and Sidney Ponson. And there were some names. I could remember some guys for hours here of those mid-2000s Orioles teams. But those were bad teams that Angelos oversaw, and it put this team completely in the pit. They were just a non-competitive team for 14 consecutive years in a baseball town. Baltimore is a baseball town to me. And the Orioles went flat for almost 15 years. Some of that was because it was his way or the highway. And that was, in doses, could have been good, but generally was not a great thing for the franchise. He ruined relationships. He fired a lot of well-liked people in the organization. He regularly went after the media when anything negative was written. He famously attacked Ken Rosenthal multiple times when he covered the O's and then was a columnist at the Baltimore Sun before leaving to become a national writer. I mean, when John Angelos suspended Kevin Brown for literally nothing this season, it wasn't the first time an Angelos owner of the Orioles had a run-in with a beloved broadcaster. Back in the 90s when John Miller was one of the best, maybe the best baseball broadcaster in the sport, was also calling Sunday Night Baseball. He was calling the Orioles games, and Peter Angelos said he didn't bleed orange and black enough and basically sent him packing. Well, Angelos went to San Francisco and ended up having a Hall of Fame career as a broadcaster for the Giants and one of the voices of the games. People did not like when he sent John Miller out of town. Also, with those great Orioles teams that were built in 96 and 97, Angelos had something to do with that. But he also ran Peter Gillick out of town, who ended up still having a good career as a GM. Davey Johnson won AL Manager of the Year in 1997. And on the day he was awarded that trophy, he resigned as manager of the Orioles in the offseason after 97 because he was just done with working with Peter Angelos and all of the run-ins the two had, very negative run-ins that the two had when working together. He pushed a lot of good people out of the organization. And also it was because he was meddling in a lot of baseball operations things. Now, John Angelos does a lot of things wrong, but I think one of the things he's done right when he was control person of the Orioles is he really didn't step in at all in the baseball operations. He left it to Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and Eve Rosenbaum and Brandon Hyde to make those decisions for the Orioles, and it worked out. They got to 101 wins last year. Now, Angelos had his fingerprints being stupid and a lot of other things, but it wasn't in a baseball sense. That was not the case for Peter Angelos. He was all over things in the baseball sense. It's even been reported that he was going to John and Lewis to get opinions on potential baseball type moves, but he would have friends around the game. He'd hear one bad thing about a player from some other executive he knew, and he'd immediately say, well, we can't sign or we can't trade for that player. He would get fixated on certain players and push across big contracts for them, which did not work out. I mean, he was kind of outbidding himself in the Chris Davis contract. Albert Bell contract didn't work out at all. I mean, even bringing in Ubaldo Jimenez certainly did not work out for the Orioles. He ran through GMs and front office staff because it was made pretty clear pretty early from when he took over in 93 that Peter Angelos himself wanted to be the GM of this team, and he would have a GM and have people to help make baseball decisions, but he was the end-all be-all. And a lot of the reporting has been he wasn't meddling in every single roster move, the call-ups, the call-down, every free agent. But when it was going to be a big move, a big trade, a big money signing, Peter Angelos not only had to approve the money, he had to approve the player and the deal as well. And he really got his hands on a lot of these moves and shut down some things. Now, it worked in the Orioles' favor sometimes, been widely reported about what happened in 1996. The GM wanted to trade away some of the Orioles veterans. They didn't have a great first half, wanted to get some young players. Angelos said, no, our fans are not going to like that we're trading away some of our best veterans. He said, keep those guys. And the Orioles ended up turning things around, making the playoffs and getting to the ALCS in 96. So that decision worked out, but a lot of them did not. And a lot of those decisions, like I talked about, led directly to those 14 consecutive losing seasons from 98 to 2011. It was not a fun stretch to be an Orioles fan. I can tell you, as you know, an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kid who loved baseball and looked around and said, this is my team, the Orioles. And it's hard to watch them play because they are not good at all. And they were not good for basically my entire childhood. And that was tough to take. And that gives me some negative reaction just from that to Peter Angelos. I mean, he was named by Sports Illustrated the worst owner in sports. I mean, there was a lot of hit pieces against him and for good reason. I mean, he was not running the baseball side well. And while some people who worked for him for the Orioles loved him as a boss, others did not. Very mixed bag across the board. Also, people who worked with him as a lawyer and worked with him as a city. Very mixed bag. He could be very abrasive as a person as well. He wanted things his way, not just with his employees, not just with baseball, but with everything he did in general. And I think that's where we come to the conclusion that it is a complicated legacy for Peter Angelos. Yes, he kept the team in Baltimore. Yes, he, put together some couple of eras of good teams. He also oversaw a lot of bad teams. And there was a lot of losing built in there, but he also did some things that no other owner would do. And that certainly makes him stick out. We also got to the point where directly because of Peter Angelos, we had John Angelos, which was a nightmare in itself, owning this baseball team and being the control person. So I'm not going to come up with some ending here if he was good here. He was bad as an owner, but he was what he was. He was certainly something. He was certainly, and this has been written in a lot of the pieces, like there will not be probably a lot of other owners that operate like Peter Angelos did. And that's what's going to allow him to stick out. And that will be his legacy. Like, it's complicated, but he certainly sticks out. And just wanted to do that episode as, again, Peter Angelos passing away on Saturday at the age of 94 and kind of moving the Orioles into their next direction. As again reported Monday that David Rubenstein, the vote is going to happen from the other owners on Wednesday, and by Thursday's opening day, I mean, David Rubenstein could be coming down the orange carpet on Thursday as the Orioles owner. And of course, we will have all that coverage right here on the podcast. We'll be back tomorrow. Episode coming out a little bit later tomorrow. Expect a Wednesday evening episode. Going to wait and see if the O's are going to make some roster moves, maybe finalize the opening day roster, maybe make some waiver claims to improve the bullpen or the bench as well. And we'll get you all that, plus all the news from the owners vote on Wednesday. So a Wednesday evening pod getting you ready for opening day on Thursday. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.